further away your ideology is from reality, the more it conflicts with reality, the more it is going to fail. Welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. Today we will start out with a recommendation. If you haven't heard of New Discourses, it is the website set up by James Lindsay. If you haven't heard of James Lindsay, he's the guy along with Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian who wrote the grievance studies papers in, I think they started writing them in 2017 and wrote them into 2018. And caused quite a controversy because what they basically did was write a bunch of hoax papers. Well, I don't know if they started out writing hoax papers, but then just they wrote essentially fake papers in all of these like feminist and women's studies and race studies journals, where they'd start with a ridiculous conclusion and then just write a ridiculous paper to support that conclusion. And long academic articles, and got many of them published in these journals, and then eventually it came out, I think their cover was blown before they wanted to or something, but, it came out that these were essentially fraudulent articles written as a, just to show how low the quality is for these kinds of journals and how they're really not academic disciplines at all. And that's what kind of catapulted Lindsay, along with his co-authors, into the news sphere. And since then, he and Helen wrote a book called Cynical Theories, which we will eventually talk about. That one just came out late last year. And so on New Discourses, on Christmas Day, Lindsay published an article called Psychopathy and the Origins of Totalitarianism. We'll include a link to it in the description. I recommend all of our viewers and listeners check it out if they haven't already, because in my opinion, it's the most important and like the best article I've read in years, and it's one of the only articles written on a topic approaching or utilizing or expanding on the book Political Ponerology by Andrzej Łobaczewski, which of course we talk about regularly and which is one of my favorite books. In this article, he focuses on a few concepts in ponerology, but puts them in his own words and basically develops these ideas on his own. And, two of those concepts are paramorality and paralogic, which we'll get into a bit, and of course psychopathy. And the one that ties them all together is this idea that he borrows the term from Joseph Pieper's 1970 essay, Abusive Language, Abusive Power, and the word is pseudo-reality. So it's about ideological pseudo-realities. And he ties these ideas together, pseudo-realities, paralogic, paramoralisms, paramorality, and with psychopathy as well, to deliver his take on basically what's going on in the world and not just what's going on now, but what has gone on for a large part of the 20th century with the development, and before then, of the development of these ideological pseudo-realities. Some examples of them are like communism, like Karl Marx. But in this case, what he's the expert on is one of the newest pseudo-realities, which is critical social justice theory. So you can find that in examples of that in the types of journals that I mentioned, and in diversity, equity, and inclusion boards, all over the country, all over the Western world. And critical race theory, there's all of those sorts of social justice oriented ideas and really practices center around this ideology. And the reason he calls it a pseudo-reality is because it is basically, there's nothing in it that matches up with objective reality. It's a fictional world that just manages to resemble reality enough that it's believable so that a lot of people can believe in it. And one of the reasons they do this, or one of the ways in which they do this, is by using a plausible language that people can then like identify with, understand to some degree, and then use that language and that framework to project that reality onto the world around them. So the way that works with racism, for instance, is that everyone knows racism exists. And for most people, the vast majority of people, at least in our cultures, see that as a problem, see racism as a problem, because that's been the trajectory for years and years and years, is to increasingly accept that it is a problem. Whereas, in previous years, even like 60 years ago, or less, you'd find more people more willing to express openly racist views and to have an openly to have openly and explicitly racist policies. So when we acknowledge that there is such a thing as racism and that it is a problem, pretty much everyone can do that. But what critical social justice theory does is redefine what racism is, to the point where racism doesn't mean what it used to mean. So there's this inversion of concepts, there's this inversion of language that goes on that is very Orwellian, to say one thing and mean another thing. Because when a social justice theorist or practitioner talks about racism, they're not talking about what ordinary people think of as racism. They're talking about something like systemic racism. And there's, in a previous show, we mentioned a video by, I think it was PSA Sitch, who's a funny, very creative YouTuber. And he did a couple videos, must be like a couple years ago now, on what racism actually is according to these people. And if I can find those, I'll include those in a link too. But if you search PSA Sitch and racism, you should be able to find them on YouTube, because it's not what you think it is. Like when they're talking about racism, it's not what you actually think it is. It's actually a form of racism. Lindsay calls it neo-racism, because it's one of the most racist things you can see. Is you are seeing yourself and everything and everyone in terms of their skin color. So that's why you'll see this. It's become I'd call it a fad, a trend to explicitly and like endlessly signal your race, whether positively or negatively. So you're either, part of the problem because of your skin color, or not part of the problem because your skin color. And it's, you'll find it in Twitter profiles or in tweets where people are explicit about what race they are. And while Lindsay doesn't talk about it in his article, I don't think, in his other writings and podcasts and things of that sort, he talks about how, or he defends colorblindness. This idea that what we should actually be doing in like a liberal society is to foster these notions of colorblindness, that your race should not come into play in any way. And that was one of the roots of like the civil rights movement, is this notion of colorblindness, these ideals of it. But that's totally flipped around, where now colorblindness is itself racist, because you can't escape being a racist if you're part of an oppressor class or an oppressor race. And so these ideas are being taught in schools, being taught to children, and essentially, most likely and almost certainly, creating more racism and creating things on top of that, in addition to racism, even inspiring. It would, to me, if I were to imagine teaching these things to children, to young children who don't have a fully developed frontal lobe, frontal lobes in their brain, who can't think for themselves, I'd see one of two things happening. I think a lot of the sensitive kids would be racked by guilt for something for a belief that they don't actually have, or a privilege that they don't actually have. Certainly beliefs that they don't have, because if anyone has grown up in a multiracial environment, they know that kids really don't care about race, and oftentimes are like literally colorblind. They won't even realize that their friends who are of different races are different in any way of them until it's pointed out to them. I've found that to be common not only in my own experience but with people I know who have, who've interacted with kids like that. So on the one hand, you instill this sense of undeserved guilt and blame onto some students, and then on others, if you're constantly teaching white kids that they live in a culture of white supremacy, for instance, I'm sure there are some kids that'll be like, "Oh, I'm white. That must mean I'm at the top," and would actually reinforce that stereotype for them, to the point where they're going to grow up to be an asshole because they've been told their whole life that
they have privilege,
and that they're important, and so they're actually, this is just a guess on my part. I don't know if anyone's actually tracked this kind of thing, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's one of the effects, is to actually reinforce and create a degree of that like supremacist attitude that wouldn't have otherwise existed if they had just been raised in a normal environment without this ideological brainwashing. But anyways, that's getting a bit, well, not off topic, but a bit away from the article that Lindsay wrote. Maybe I'll just say read it, because especially if you've read Ponerology before and you want to see someone who understands it and who can apply it to the present day and real life examples of what's going on.
Well, Harrison, before you do that, just a quick note. For those who may be new to our channel, the book that Harrison was mentioning is Political Ponerology by Andrzej Łobaczewski. And in a nutshell, it describes the psychological processes by which a society becomes influenced or ponerized by a network of, or even a small number of pathological individuals, and discusses the weaknesses that many normal people may have in dealing with the influence of psychopathic thinking, and not knowing, being vulnerable to what psychopathic thinking or paramoralisms or ideas that are just based on twisted ideas and ideology, what effects these ideas can have and what influence they can have at a macro social level. So just wanted to give a quick recap on that. And of course, it's I'll just add that this article is a really wonderful kind of update in a way, and a revivification of Ponerology, and a kind of affirmation of its value to us, especially as we use it to reevaluate what we're seeing in terms of Ponerology.
So we can, well, how do we want to take this? We can take it as just like a further development or investigation of or expansion of James's article, or we can try and look at it or use it to look at what's going on right now, because you had mentioned, all the different critical justice, social justice theory, invasion of education and everything else, and what might it look like because this isn't just an American phenomenon either. This is global. I mean, you have Justin Trudeau bowing to the feet of, bowing before the social justice warriors, and same with some of the other some of the European prime ministers and electorate or electors. So it's a lot more complex now than just to examine one particular nation and see what it would look like to evolve in that kind of a way, and how to, I guess, see what things might look like moving forward on this wider scale?
Well, maybe to start with, I should say something about psychopathy. Last week we interviewed Dr. George Simon, who wrote In Sheep's Clothing about dealing with manipulative people and the types of manipulation tactics that they use. And like he mentioned, when he first wrote the book, he didn't get very good reception for it, among the academic world or even in conferences. But over the years, he's gotten a lot better reception. Like, people are a bit more aware of it. I think nowadays people are, it's in the zeitgeist enough that people are more receptive to this idea. But still, people have a hard time imagining the level of malevolence that comes from a psychopath. And as we move on, I'll explain, why this is so important. Most people are familiar with like criminals, and with serial killers, and there's there's an entire book market for books on serial killers and TV shows and movies. Recently you've got shows like, David Fincher has always for years done stuff on serial killers like
Zodiac.
7. Yeah, 7, and the Mindhunters, which one was it? Hunter or Hunters, the Netflix show.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are kind of aware of that. And one of our most popular shows that we did on this channel was on Israel Keyes, the famous Alaskan serial killer. And most serial killers are psychopaths. So that might be the extent that most people who don't look into this kind of thing have about the phenomenon. But that's not the extent of psychopathy. Only a tiny percent of psychopaths are serial killers. So for whatever reason, some psychopaths become serial killers. But you can learn a lot by looking at serial killers. And then if you take away the serial killing out of them, that mentality that they have, that worldview, that mindset, that total lack of conscience and total disregard for the rights and well-being of other people, that extends to a large chunk of the population. By large, I mean, the estimates are around 1% of the population is a psychopath. And nowadays there's more research on like what's called the dark triad. I think we did a show on that.
Mm-hmm.
And so Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and was narcissism the third one? But so depending on how you measure psychopathy, because there are various different like psychometric instruments to determine if someone's a psychopath. In the clinical sense, if you use the Hare checklist, I think the cutoff is like 30 out of 40 that that person is deemed a psychopath, and it seems to be a pretty accurate test for like prison populations and things like that. But when you're measuring psychopathy in the general population among non-convicted criminals, you can still pick up on psychopathic traits. And using the more kind of like toned down versions, I guess you could call them, of these sorts of tests, I think I've read in some articles, some researchers hypothesize that maybe even up to 4 or 5% of at least the American population can be deemed psychopathic to some degree or another. So there, the boundaries are kind of a bit blurry, what the actual percentage is. But like Łobaczewski, he estimated 0.6% of the Polish population back in the 60s and 70s when he was working in Poland. So you could guess that it's going to be around there. It's going to be 1%, give or take. It could be more, it could be less. But when you factor in other types of personality disorders and the kind of the effects of various things on the brain and the minds and the values of non-psychopaths, you get a lot of people that can maybe approach that level or what, as Lindsay calls it, become like functional psychopaths. They may not actually be psychopaths, but they've adopted the worldview to such an extent, the beliefs to such an extent that they can act in certain psychopathic ways. And so as an example of that, I'd cite the show we did on the book Ordinary Men. And of course, there's the Milgram experiments and things like that show if you put people in certain situations, they can do horrendous things that appear for all intents and purposes, well, and probably can be classified to some degree as psychopathic, even if they themselves are not essentially a psychopath. Because a psychopath it's pretty much a personality structure. The research suggests that kids essentially are born that way. There are structural differences in the way their brains are formed that lead to the development of what we call psychopathy. So you'll find children, very young children, who display what they call callous and unemotional traits. So even from a very young age, you'll find that psychopaths don't have a conscience. They are not moved by the types of emotions that the vast majority of people are moved by. And that can it might come across in a young child as like a total self-centeredness, which is, not necessarily abnormal when you phrase it that way for a young child, but total self-centeredness to the exclusion of like considering anyone else. So kids who won't share, who use violence to get their way, who torture animals, who show no signs of like remorse or guilt over harming other people. And as psychopaths grow up, they keep that mentality. And not only do they keep that mentality, but they learn to fake being a normal human. And that's the thing that gets a lot of people, is that psychopaths are con men. They know how to manipulate other people so that other people don't realize what they're like on the inside. I think it's Robert Hare, one of the preeminent researchers on psychopathy, who tells a story. I think he was even consulting with an actress, blonde 90s actress. I can't remember. It wasn't Sharon Stone, I don't think, but someone else who was filming a movie where she played essentially a psychopathic character, and one of the scenes, I guess, was her witnessing a car crash and looking at the faces of the people around her, who were like horrified and shocked and crying, and then she went home in her mirror and learned to mimic their facial expressions, so that she could then fake it, pretend, be able to blend in with the crowd basically, and pretend to be horrified by something that didn't affect her at all. So psychopaths do not have the same emotional makeup that humans have. They totally lack any sense of value for other people. They basically use other people as strictly like objects for their own purposes. So they will essentially sacrifice other people, manipulate them, use them, abuse them just to get what they want, and manipulate them. Whether it's in the workplace, Hare wrote a book with Paul Babiak called Snakes in Suits about corporate psychopaths who just steamroll anyone in their path, steal other people's work, blame people for problems, create problems for other people, make things up about other people to get them fired, to then move into their position, and basically just slash people down as they work their way up the corporate ladder with no regard for those other people. These are the kind of people that would that steal money from grandmas and any type of con or manipulation. It's like psychopaths are excellent at that because they have no regard for the other people to whom they are doing these types of things. So that's the kind of just a very brief and incomplete overview of what a psychopath is actually like. The reason that Lindsay includes psychopathy in the title of this article and in the content of it is because psychopathy, even if it's not immediately apparent, psychopathy is probably the most important driver of what we see as these destructive ideological movements. Because one of the things about psychopaths is that this probably isn't the best way to phrase it. There's probably a better word to use, but they can't cope with reality. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that they can't cope like some people can't cope, and it's just too much for them. It's like this existential like grief and anguish about the nature of reality. No, they can't cope with reality in the sense that reality is designed, most societies are designed for normal people. It's normal people interacting and doing normal things. Well, maybe it's better to say psychopaths don't fit in a normal reality. They are they're they're almost like aliens, you know, in this alien world where are surrounded by all these weird people, where they're this tiny minority who see the world completely differently, and they are forced to then pretend to be part of the kind of mainstream reality. Because when people realize what a psychopath's like, they want nothing to do with them. And often, well, that's why, like, something like, I can't remember, I think it's something like 80% of criminals in, like, that have gone away, you know, got put away for serious crimes, something like 80% of those people in prison are psychopaths. That's where societies tend to put psychopaths, is they tend to segregate them in some way, whether in prison or, well, yeah, mostly in prison. And I'm sure in other societies it was other means of separating them from the social body. Like there are stories of like northern, I think an Inuit group who have stories of this particular type of person, and when no one's looking, they'll push them off on, you know, on an iceberg and just, you know, let them float away, because they cause so much damage to the tribe or to whatever social unit they have. And so naturally psychopaths, they have their own type of resentment, because they live in a world where they can't be who they want to be necessarily, openly, for sure. And they can't get what they want, and they feel like they deserve everything handed to them. They don't necessarily feel like they should have to work to gain anything. Other people should just give it to them, because they are such great people. And that's why, like, a corporate psychopath will use another person's work, appropriate it, and then create a situation to then, you know, get that person fired or make them look bad and take all the credit. It's because they don't actually want to do anything. It's much easier for them to just use someone else's work or steal it to get what they want. This gets back, you know, it's the idea of the criminal mind that we mentioned in George Simon's interview, and that we've talked about before. The criminal mind is totally entitled, that they think that they deserve whatever they have just out of their sense of self-entitlement. They don't have to work for anything. So a great example is the Cash Me Outside girl, right? And several people on Dr. Phil, where you see these totally entitled kids who think it's okay just to steal someone else's property or destroy someone else's property, just because either they want to, or they think they need it, or they're not thinking about it at all. It's just a whim. So this is this concept, and this is this reality. And like I mentioned at the start of talking about psychopathy, a lot of people can't fathom the depths of the malevolence. That's why it's a good practice to do a little reading on serial killers, because you'll get a very good idea of just how far the depths of that can go. So to like the most horrendous types of, like, torture and murder that you can imagine, and the psychopath, the serial killer in this example, enjoying it. So you can add an element of sadism on top of everything else. There are some psychopaths who are actually sadists, who enjoy making other people suffer, who enjoy toying with and experimenting with people, and just seeing what they can do, seeing with what they can get away with. So there's a wider sphere of what you might call a grouping of mental illness of a sorts, into which we'd class these types of, the psychopathy and other personality disorders, of people who don't fit in the world, who don't feel like they fit in society, who feel wronged by society. Not necessarily because of anything that's actually been done to them, but simply because society isn't set up in the way that they want. They feel wronged by the world for the way the world is set up.
Well, yeah, that's like you're saying, the psychopaths don't fit in the world because the world is not suited or meant for them. Mm-hmm. So it's very similar in the way that when a society is structured one way, and just a group of normal human beings don't get what they deserve, which is to say, like, they are oppressed in a real way, like their rights are trampled on, or they're not being allowed to have jobs, or what have you, they will naturally revolt in some way, shape, or form. And so that's very similar to what you see with the psychopath, except that it's not really justified,
Right.
or, well, I guess to them it's justified because, again, they're not getting their needs met. The difference is that, like, their needs are antithetical to the survival of the species.
Yeah.
And therein lies the problem. So you can't really build a society for them because they'll just go around killing, maiming, torturing, raping, pillaging, the whole 9 yards of everyone, and there'd be no society left for them to do anything with. And so it's just kind of like, what can you do except to separate or segregate them in some way? And with like what you were saying with researching or reading about serial killers, it's, getting an idea of just the sheer malevolence of being able to torture, like you were saying, and not have any qualms about it is a very drastic change of I don't even know how to describe it other than, like, it's an inner landscape that's so completely foreign that it's difficult, if not really impossible, to actually, like, get into that mindscape. And then adding on top of it, which may not be as readily apparent as if you were looking at something like cult leaders, would be the ability to manipulate in subtle ways, and their ability to get people to do what it is that they want them to do. Again, they're trying to get their needs, their wants, their whims met in some kind of a way, and they don't care how they do it or who they have to hurt or manipulate to get there. But it's not cut down or so myopic to only apply to one person or even a couple of people. It can be applied to hundreds or thousands or millions, depending upon the size of the audience that the person has in front of them, which also kind of depends on, like, whether they're a successful psychopath or not. Because if you are successful, which is to say that they're able to move within a society undetected because they have this mask and they've worked on it, assuming they have a really good mask, well, then they can manipulate their way to tops of different hierarchical structures one way or another. And then they have this huge swath of people that are below them that they can use to manipulate and get all of these things that they want and they think that they are owed. But the rest of us would disagree.
Well, there are a couple of things there, and one is that we talked about how difficult it is to really viscerally understand the level of malevolence that exists among psychopaths and individuals who are not necessarily sadistic or on the level of serial killers, but even just successful psychopaths, snakes in suits, as was mentioned earlier, people who would act out of a Machiavellian narcissistic imperative to better themselves at the cost of all others, but with these buffers of civility and personality and charisma and the vulnerability that many individuals have in being biased and in projecting their own human qualities onto people who don't deserve it. So I think one of the larger points, the bigger points here about having a healthy psychological outlook is to realize that we quite often unconsciously just assume as a matter of course that many people are healthy and normal individuals who aren't so willing to screw over someone else to better their position. And on the subject of numbers, we said as a conservative estimate, 1% of the population is a full-on psychopath. let's take a moment and think about what that means, because in the United States, what do we have, about 270 million individuals?
No, more than that.
Three,
It's over 300
Is it
million.
over 330 or something.
330. Okay, so
I don't know.
330. So
Close
let's say it's 300 million, for instance. That means that 1% of the population
3 million.
is 3 million psychopaths. 3 million. Now, you imagine not all of them are intelligent or successful or just smart enough to get over on a lot of people. Many of them might be incarcerated. But just imagine that half of them, 1.5 million. Can you imagine what 1.5 million people, a portion of which will go into politics, a portion of which will go into Wall Street, a portion of which will go into the technocracy or law enforcement?
Healthcare or psychological health.
Yes, any number of fields. You have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals who are willing to say and do anything in order to bolster their own position of power. And you don't need that many to wreak havoc on a large scale. So
we've introduced some of these ideas. The way this all fits together is that, well, I'll start with this. Is there a reason, I'm going to ask a leading question, is there a reason that when you look at a lot of the protests and riots over the last 6 months, since summer of last year, why a lot of the people who end up being arrested or investigated to any degree, a lot of the leaders of these like Antifa cells or whatever, turn out to be convicted felons and pedophiles, sex offenders? What is it about a protest, well, I wouldn't even say a protest movement, what is it about an ideological movement bent on revolution and restructuring society that attracts these types of people? Because...
Well, I was just going to say that there's two aspects to that. There's the particular and then there's the general. And so with these in particular, you can see why they're attracted to this particular movement, because it is founded upon the critical social justice theories, which are psychopathic in nature. You know, it's a completely restructured pseudo-reality that's all based on lies and manipulations. And so they're attracted to this movement in particular because it reflects what they want, which is a restructuring of society along their lines. But then, and that's in the specific, in the general sense, it provides them cover for being able to do the very things that they want to do the whole time. You know, they want to go out and burn stuff and smash things and kill people and rape and whatever. These are the things that they wanted to do all along.
Right.
And now they have an ability and a reason and, you know, a whole justification, whatever, to be able to do it and possibly get away with it.
Yeah, most likely get away with
and
it.
most likely get away with it. So
yeah, so it's the perfect breeding ground for criminals because they know they can get away with it. And the payoff, the ultimate payoff that might, you know, that they perceive, I think, could be in the future for them is power. This is why it's the same whenever you look at a revolutionary movement. You have a lot of examples to look at in the 20th century where it was the same kind of people involved, you know, and when I say that, the same kind of people involved, I don't mean that every revolutionary movement is always composed of all these types of people. There are always individuals of this sort who are within revolutionary movements for these reasons. And look at what happened in the Russian Revolution. Well, who ended up getting power? Who ended up on top? It was the worst of the worst. Same in Mao's China. And not only that, like in the Russian Revolution, you had a whole bunch of kind of competing socialist revolutionary movements and groups and Marxist groups. And it was Lenin and the Bolsheviks who were kind of the most radical of the bunch who ended up on top because they were the most conscienceless. They were the most willing to stab and shoot their way to the top. And on top of that, then you have a series of successive purges among the ideological movement. And you find this, the best example I've read recently is in Frank Dickhuter's books on Mao's revolution. He's got a trilogy of books, and the one I read was on the Great Famine. And throughout, it was even going on for like 20 years, successive purges of the weak members of the party of the ideological movement, whose absence then creates a vacuum for the most cutthroat, bloodthirsty elements to rise to the top. So you have this increasing concentration and refinement of the movement to the point where Łobaczewski argues when this process essentially completes itself, you have what you might call a total inversion of society's structure. In a relatively normal society, as we've been discussing, psychopaths tend to end up either in exile or in prison, in some way taken out of the body politic, or marginalized in such a way that they're on the outskirts of society. They're the criminals and the con men, on the fringes of society, getting by, going from town to town, city to city, conning people, and not really integrating in the social framework, in the social fabric, because it's difficult for them. Like, they can't keep a job for the most part, in a lot of cases. What you have in this pathological process is an inversion where all of the leadership positions and positions of authority are then staffed by and held by psychopaths. Łobaczewski argues, I don't know if this is necessarily true or not, or if this is just an ideal case, but he argues that 100%, I'd say, at least approaching 100%, the vast majority of the psychopaths in any given population will then be part of the ruling structure. So it's a total reshaping of the fabric of society, because the way societies normally function, it's this, how to describe it? Almost this natural process. It's unconscious for the people involved in it, but we naturally have a way of structuring ourselves. You'll notice this in any group, any small group or large group, where people tend to find their place within a group. Some people gravitate to leadership positions who are good leaders, who are fit for the role, and some people are happier in a supporting position. Some people find some degree of fulfillment just doing a menial job every day. And I know people like this. I know there are people like this who work the same job every day and aren't going to launch a revolutionary movement because they feel they aren't getting enough out of life. They've got what they want. They've got their job. They've got their things they do when they get home and that they do on their weekends, and they're at least relatively satisfied with their place in life. And that naturally shapes itself to the point where, and in an ideal case, like the people who are really smart do things that utilize their smartness. The people who are really good with their bodies, become athletes and do great things in sports and athletics. And people who are great at the arts become are able to support themselves by doing what they're good at and what they love. And people who are good at business become businessmen, and etc. People find their place, and for the most part, the people who make up society aren't psychopaths, and the people who find their place within that social hierarchy and framework.
So similarly, there's a restructuring of society along these psychopathic lines, where there is this utopic vision in the psychopath's mind of what they dream of. Mm-hmm. And along the way, they have to start off small. They have to start off with something that's reasonable, like a pseudo-reality that maps to reality to, at least a great degree, in order for it to start to take hold. And then as it progressively gets or comes closer to fruition, it gradually has to change in order for the utopic vision to come to full fruition. So it has to subtly change. And then I guess along certain points, somebody starts to question things, or it can only go so far. Is that kind of the way that it works? Is that like it reaches a certain point where, you know, they can't really take it any farther along these lines, and so they have to change it, and they need to purge? Or what's kind of like the mechanism there? Because it was an interesting aspect of James's article that I hadn't really thought about, as to like why the purges.
Which purges though? Like the well, the I'll go off on a bit and let me know if if this is what you mean. So there are, I'm describing, or I was describing this kind of the way things normally work, but things go wrong. So Łobaczewski at least identifies certain aspects of a society that kind of weaken the social structure. One of the examples he gives, and this is just one. Well, I'll give two. One, he says a very important thing for any society and their health, and kind of like as a vaccine against this sort of thing taking place, is their general psychological knowledge and just the way things work. So he'd argue that if you compare different societies, different cultures, you'd be able to rank them on their psychological knowledge, like just overall for the individuals in different in different cultures. So a society who has a greater psychological knowledge, and that would mean awareness of different kinds of psychological problems like psychopathy, as well as ideas about actual mental health and what's good and what's healthy, as opposed to people who and societies who have maybe an overly simplistic view of human nature, and who have like structured their society based on this simplified view of human nature, which applies to Łobaczewski would argue, and I'd agree, most social philosophies applying to humanity and societies for the last 200 years. You know, there was a lot of probably the majority of famous philosophers have a very a very oversimplistic view of human nature, for instance. But the other thing is something as simple as, I was describing that social structure, that can be perverted and inverted in a certain way very easily. And he calls this over and under adjustment, or something like that. Above and, well, I can't remember the exact phrase he uses, but basically, if you're an incompetent person and somehow you get put in a position of power and authority above your level of competence, this could be through nepotism or just circumstance, or you might be a shady individual and you kind of have manipulated your way into this position for some reason. That creates two types of problems. First, a person who's incompetent in a position and doing things that they're not competent to do will tend to act out in certain ways that aren't healthy for the organization or for the rest of the people over whom they have authority. Łobaczewski says in his experience that such people tend to adopt a kind of totalitarian, overly controlling method of leadership, because they, on some level, they know that they can't actually do the job that they're there to do. Actually, it reminds me of a couple people in Ertugrul, but then for the people, of course, the people working under them will feel a resentment towards that person, because it's like, well, here's a person who's no smarter than me in this position that's way above me, and he doesn't deserve it. So why don't I get that? People are very you could say class conscious, or they're just aware of the social hierarchy. That's one of those natural things about humans, is that we unconsciously, we're constantly noticing those kinds of things. Who's above us in the social hierarchy? Who's below us? And then you can have a person who's very intelligent and creative, who is in a position below their station. And that breeds resentment too. So Łobaczewski at least argues that to the degree that that's going on in a society, that that is kind of the primary weakness, that it can be the primary weakness towards this kind of, like, let's say, ideological and social and societal infection taking hold. When you have all of this maladjustment within the social structure. So you'll get a whole bunch of resentful people that are a perfect breeding ground for revolutionary movements. Because society is so unequally, unfairly structured that we might as well, like as you were saying, we might as well have a revolution to make things right. So, but then one thing that Łobaczewski doesn't actually talk about, but which I think is something to keep in mind, is that even in a society like that, especially in a society that is falling prey to various kinds of societal sicknesses, illnesses, is that you will always find, probably even in the most healthy societies relative to others, you'll find psychopaths who do manage to make it into positions of power. It's probably just a constant, no matter what society you live in. And so I'd also argue that to the degree that that happens, that also weakens a society and makes them more susceptible to this kind of macro-social, revolutionary, pathological process. So you can, because if you look at, I'll just leave it at that. So you've got all these things that can create a weakness and kind of start fracturing the ties that make up the network of society, the naturally forming network of society. That the way I kind of picture it is, if you picture a kind of like a family tree or something to represent a social hierarchy or network, it doesn't have to be pyramidal, but just all of these nodes. The way I say it is like various points of like disease, like popping up, and sometimes they spread. Sometimes you might have like a society that is relatively mostly healthy, with little bits here and there, and then you might have one portion of it that's just like totally diseased. That's the way I've kind of seen the United States is like, oh, here's the CIA and the intelligence community, and and everyone, okay, there's a bunch of corruption here, a bunch of psychopathy here, but there's a one group that's oversaturated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, but for the most part, people can and do deal with this sort of thing. Like, we still put psychopaths in prison when we catch them because they commit crimes. We've got laws on the books in pretty much every society where it's a natural sorting mechanism that takes out the criminal element and puts them away somehow. And even in a natural setting, I'd say like overall, I could be wrong about this, but overall people tend to be able to survive this kind of situation. It's not like everything just gets destroyed constantly because of the influence of psychopaths. It's like people are pretty good at surviving and making things better to a degree. And that seems to have been that's kind of the way I see most at least most Western societies for recent years, is that for all of the things wrong with them, they still manage to at least croak by, and get by without a total collapse. So I think that's one reason for the necessity of purges to some degree, and other phenomena, is that there's just so many relatively normal people that it's impossible to naturally invert that social structure without some kind of revolutionary knocking over of the chessboard, basically. What needs to be you
mean coming from normal people?
No. This would be coming from a revolutionary movement. Like the way to reorder society is only ever to totally reorganize it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why in the 20th century, at least, the way that pathocracies, as Łobaczewski calls it, the way that these kind of social systems have come into being is through a revolutionary movement, where they basically wipe out the entire existing elite class, replace them with their own members, and then enforce a totalitarian regime where everything is controlled, and there's no independent there are no independent cells of freedom to any degree. It's not like the totalitarian revolutionary movement and gains control of power of an entire country and then says, oh, well, we're just going to leave this area of society alone. They can do their own thing.
Right.
That never happens. It's always total control.
Yes. I was going to say that if the ultimate goal is to develop some kind of centrally controlled pathocracy, where you have a very tight-knit, unquestioning order or new order to society, then it becomes necessary to even target and purge those who may have initially helped things along to start with, who have their own ideas and versions of what the revolution and utopia might look like, in order to make the power structure as pure as possible. Now, and we can apply this, we've mostly been applying it to the left and to communism and socialism, but we can also look at the far right in Nazi Germany, where one of the earliest groups of Hitler sympathizers were the brown shirts, who themselves, after a while, outlived their use because they were quite thuggish and disorderly. And in order to make this more tight-knit, finer order of power and hierarchy with, Hitler at the summit, they knocked all these guys off. So,
well, there was the actual question that I was kind of thinking about in my mind was specifically like along those lines. Like, once the pathocracy has already started, like, why do they continue to purge themselves? Which got me thinking about something you had said about Mao's revolution, where they had their quotas that they had to meet, and they couldn't meet it, and so they had to lie. And then some of the people were like, actually, this isn't entirely accurate. And so instead of being like, okay, let's fix that, they said, okay, you're dead. And so that's kind of, I think, where part of it at least comes from, is the fact that eventually, no matter how far along the pathocratic movement is, some normal people will adopt some, but not all. Others will adopt more, but not all. And so it just kind of reaches a point where somebody says, like, actually, this doesn't map to reality here. And so that's kind of why they have to get purged, is because they're willing to point out that it doesn't map to reality,
right,
at whatever point.
Admit it.
Yeah, and they're willing to admit it.
Yeah. Well, even not even necessarily intentionally.
Yeah.
It's like if through their actions for some reason or another, the falseness of the pseudo-reality is exposed, then they must be destroyed for having it revealed.
They could have completely altruistic purposes, wanting the revolution to succeed, but simply because they point out a simple fact that, exposes a wider narrative, they get exposed and, done away with. And that actually reminded me of something else, and I can't remember who it was, but there was a corporation where there was a new CEO put in, and, things were not looking good for the company and they were doing bad. But nobody was telling the top brass about it because they were afraid. And so, they bring in this new CEO and everybody's really like anxious, and they're like, I don't know how this is going to go, because it can go one of two ways. Like, somebody can ask you, like, what's going on? How's your department? And it can be like Mao's China, where it's like, it's just a bunch of yes men and you lie.
We're over target.
We're over target. Or you can have it like, this corporation did, where, what's the situation? And they're like, actually, we are down, 5%. And, that was the crucial moment, because it could be, if you have a psychopathic person trying to push this pathocratic system and the pseudo-reality, that exposes the pseudo-reality. You can either get punished or you can get, supported from it. And in that particular instance, they were like, good, thank you. Someone's actually telling me the truth for once. So we can actually like build something that is actually functional.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about how Ford Motor Company might have had
Was it
its
Ford?
Yeah, I
big
think it was-
turnaround
I think
about
it was
20
from
years ago.
7 Habits of Highly Affected People. I think that was one of the
Yeah.
examples you gave in the book.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, I thought it might have been from the book Insight, but the whole point was that this
Oh,
guy
maybe.
was willing
Yeah,
to listen to even people outside the company and on the lower echelons who were willing to say what the people he was immediately surrounded by were not willing to say,
Yeah.
which was, this is what you have to do to make things better. But anyway, it would be great, Harrison, I know you wanted to delve a little bit into the actual article. There are some gems in there, especially defining what pseudo-reality actually is, and the ideological paralogic.
Do you want to go into that?
Sure.
I wanted to just make one comment that about the Mao thing that you were talking about, and the reason for these purges. One comment: there's no honor among thieves, first of all, and so that even if you are, even if you are a diehard true believer in the revolution, that doesn't mean that your head might be the next one on the chopping block. If you're a pathological exploiting the movement like all the other pathologicals, that still doesn't mean that you're in the free and clear. If you just manage to screw up, then you'll be just as heartlessly thrown out with the trash as anyone else, just by virtue of circumstance. So there's absolutely no level of, like psychopaths don't have any type of like interpersonal bond with each other. So it's not like, he kind of screwed up, but he's such a great guy and he's my friend. It's like, no, okay, less competition for me. So it is a totally ruthless and heartless environment. You can't apply normal human like interactions and the motivations for normal human interactions to a group of people like this. And the reason that these types of failures happen, one reason that these types of purges happen once a movement like this is in control, in addition to there being people who aren't 100% on board or 100% in the know, is that this is one of the points that Lindsay argues in the article, is that something like, to the degree that the further away your ideology is from reality, the more it conflicts with reality, the more it is going to fail. So in the case of Mao's China and like the Great Leap Forward and the resulting famine, the famine happened because they were so divorced from objective reality that everything fell apart. And it was just like in the Soviet Union, it was an entire culture founded upon lies.
Mm-hmm.
And everything was lying. You had to lie about everything. So when you have everybody lying about everything, nothing's going to work. And so when nothing works, then someone has to take the blame. And then that opens, like I said, it creates a vacuum for even worse people to come in and just compounds the problem. So,
well, just taking it to the types of developments that we're seeing in the West, and in particular in the U.S., as a child of the 70s and 80s, and I'm sure I've said this before here, to wake up one day a couple of years ago and realize that reality has been inverted yet again. First, it was in the 2000s under Bush in a neoconservative version of reality, and then it's swung in this other sick direction towards far left communist socialist thinking with what we're seeing now. And to realize and to see how pervasive this is in the U.S., to see how it's taken over the discourse, the language, the thoughts and ideas, and what people are saying and doing to the extent that it has, I can't stress this enough. It's mind-boggling. So to read an article such as Lindsay's that describes in some detail how this process takes place and what the levels of intelligence are, and how these paralogical ideas get foisted upon individuals, and how individuals who may be very intelligent, as he says, how they
Very smart people.
very smart people is how he calls it, how they assimilate and respond to and go along with, to the extent that they do, all of these, in real, truthful, logical terms, these illogical ideas, is fascinating and a new kind of way for us to immunize ourselves from the types of things that we're seeing on a daily basis. So this is from a section of this really long but worth reading essay called Ideological, Paralogic. And Lindsay says, because the pseudo-reality is not real and does not correspond in any faithful way to objective reality, it cannot be described in terms that are logical. In the realm of how it thinks about the world, a pseudo-reality will employ an alternative logic, a paralogic, an illogical fake logic that operates beside logic, that has internally comprehensible rules and structure, but that does not produce logical results. Indeed, it necessarily must correspond not to reality, but to pseudo-reality, and it must also, therefore, violate the law of non-contradiction. That is, a pseudo-real paralogic will always be internally, and often unrepentantly, inconsistent and self-contradictory. Just like anti-fascists, but they're fascists. Inclusiveness, but don't include conservatives, as but one obvious example. This can be taken as a symptom that a paralogic is being presented in support of a pseudo-reality, as can be any sustained attack on principles of objectivity and reason. And one of the ways that we're seeing this sustained attack on principles of objectivity and reason is to shut everybody up across the board. If you have an opinion that's opposed to this larger, critical theory discourse, then you must be racist. You must be evil. You must be pro-Hitler.
That's exactly why they're
xenophobic.
Against free speech. They hate free speech because they can't control what people say, and they can't control the fact that they don't control reality. But if they control the narrative, they think they can control reality, and so that's why they hate free speech.
And this is where this movement that we're seeing is so ruthless, because what it says is that if you're not going along with this way of thinking, this pseudo-reality, this paralogical way of thinking, then you are evil. Because how can you not be against racism? How can you not be against xenophobia or any one of these phobias?
It's so masterful, I hate to say.
Yeah.
But
devious.
It's so devious,
yes,
that they take these things that are ostensibly true, in the sense that racism is wrong in the sense that it doesn't really map to reality and causes all kinds of harm, and xenophobia, we can all agree that these aren't good things, but that's where they get you in the trap, because then once you acknowledge this little portion of their pseudo-reality as being true, then they can start using their paramoralistic word games to just smash you to pieces. It's devious and sick.
Yeah. And because people are afraid to question this sort of thing, there's a tendency to go along with the crowd, to submit, to not be subject to the attacks. So it's an absolutist, totalitarian approach to psychology, towards rebuilding society, towards really destroying the mental health of a good part of the population who doesn't realize what they're undergoing, what this ponerization is doing to their minds, to their responses to things, and it really takes a certain amount of looking back and an objective reality and weighing of the messages that are being inflicted upon people. I mean, you know, that image of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the rest of them, you know, kneeling and wearing the culturally
appropriate
African garb. I mean, you know, this couldn't be more insincere. But they realize that this is the ideology of the moment that is going to help secure their own positions of power. When at the end of the day, all of their policies, however they're branded, whatever they're called, are destructive to their own constituency.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of how heartless and just how devious and malevolent it is. I can't remember what I was reading recently. I think it was an article in the Federalist on just what's going on in American society at the moment, and how every kind of revolutionary and every authoritarian thinks that they're doing the right thing. They don't see themselves as authoritarians. And you'll see this on Twitter currently, at the present moment. All of the people who are cheering like the banning of Donald Trump from all these social networks, not seeing the wider implications of it. They're just happy that it happened, and can't see basically that that they are the authoritarians, just like a lot of anti-fascists can't see that they are the fascists. In their mind, they are righteous and just people doing the right thing against evil people who deserve it. And so there's that element where you can have, again, there are examples going around, you can have children of parents, you can have children and young adults turning in their parents to the FBI or their uncles or aunts because they know that they attended the rally, on Capitol Hill on the 6th. Whether or not they were involved in any kind of violence or whatever, they're like, oh, I know my uncle was there. I called the FBI and I turned him in, giving the names of their parents or whatever. And these people think that, or a lot of these people, I'll say, think that they are actually battling evil, fighting evil by doing this. Now, as evil as that is, to a degree, because that's what always happens, every time this happens in human history, you're going to get people like that. What a lot of people don't realize is that there is a significant portion of those kind of people who are they're psychopaths. They're doing this for psychopathic reasons. It's like, I'm going to destroy this person's life. It's like, I don't care whether they were at the rally or not. I'm just going to destroy them. And that's what you see a lot on Twitter. A lot of it is hidden. It's not on the surface. You can't tell just by reading a tweet, but social media, the internet, has always been a perfect breeding ground, a perfect playground for psychopaths and pedophiles because of the anonymity. They can create tens, hundreds of accounts, however many they need. They can go into anonymous chat rooms. They can, groom children. They can do whatever they want, and you won't be able to tell. There are a lot. So I'd argue that a lot of what's going on, a lot of these people that are doing these sorts of things on social media, for instance, a lot of the cancel culture and a lot of the snitching and the Stasi and Gestapo type activities that are going on is just totally manipulative, malevolent people who are just out there to ruin people's lives. It's like when they see something, when they're going through someone's Twitter profile and find something 8 years ago, 10 years ago, it's like, I've got this, I got this guy. I'm going to ruin him.
Isn't that something?
I'm going to destroy this person.
Mm-hmm.
And they get a kick out of it. It's fun. There are people like that. There are people who are out there who just want to destroy your life completely to whatever degree possible that they can. That's the depth of, well, that's not even the depth. That's one of the depths.
For no other reason other than the fact that they just don't like you.
Right. Yeah.
That's all it takes. They don't like you for any reason at all. You looked at them in a mean way. You criticized them for doing something that was, rightfully criticized even.
Well, there's another dimension to this, and that is that the critical race theory and to some degree Black Lives Matter and to some degree Antifa and Black Bloc groups are all seeking to accrue power to themselves in a way that would include sometimes attacking. It's a tearing down of something in order to feel empowered. And it's not an authentic integration or constructive, individuation or realization of one's abilities and earning their way through a job and a relationship and a family. It's it's seeking to tear down in order to build themselves up. And that's part of the utopian philosophy. So it happens on this macro level, and then we see it on this larger level, which manifests itself in the burning of cities, in the attacking of civic institutions, in the propping up of leaders who pay credence to their philosophy, or at least tacitly permit them to do what they're going to do. But I think we'd also do well to realize that so much of these movements have become institutionalized. The types of thinking that we're seeing reflected in far left liberal culture these days is being literally taught in universities across the board. And these organizations that are protesting and at worst, causing civil discord are highly organized in many cases and financed and brainchild and thought out by people that they don't even realize are pulling the strings, all for larger kinds of policies and movements that are beyond the scope, beyond the vision of the individual protesters' imagination.
Yeah, it's thinking specifically about the riots in these major cities, and then they go around and someone tells them, "Hey, go burn down that building," and they're getting paid for some of this stuff, and they go and they burn down the building. They're like, all right, cool, I get to burn down a building and I get paid for it. Sweet, I'm all for it. Unbeknownst to them, they're actually clearing the real estate for the whoever it is to come in and buy it all for pennies on the dollar later. Mm-hmm. Like you're saying, these are all like games within games, and the people on the bottom level who are just either opportunistic or blind believers are getting used and played in ways they cannot fathom, to their detriment and our own.
Everyone's getting played. Like, even the people. Well, let's say you've got a corporation, right? Okay, because first of all, woke ideology has infected universities, education on all levels, from kindergarten up, big tech, woke finance, every corporation on the planet. Well, every corporation not on the planet, but in our
all
Western
the mega
world,
corporations.
yeah, all the mega corporations. Well, not even mega corporations. Every at least like semi-large corporation has these, like, what are they called, like diversity, equity, and inclusion boards, and it's so pretty much every aspect of society, and that covers a chunk of them. The entire, the majority, the most important people in the internet, in finance, in business, and largely in politics. It's everywhere. But let's say you've got a corporation, some big corporation, some mega corporation that is kowtowing to the mob and doing these photo ops and doing everything right. Or think about a similar example, like a Joe Biden supporter on the street of where one of these riots is taking place, with his Joe Biden sign at the front. They're somehow destroying his property, and he's on his porch. I'm thinking of a real video saying, "You guys, I support you. I'm Joe Biden.
Look at my sign.
Look at my sign." It's like that doesn't matter. All of these like cowards and lackeys at the top of these corporations who are just selling themselves for to virtue signal and be part of the crowd. They're not safe. Like no one's safe. The people on the bottom are being used. The people on the top are being used. And like in Mao's China, any one of them could be next. I think that's one important point that a lot of the people supporting this don't realize, is that you could be next. You probably will be.
Yeah, as many billboards and signs and commercials and everything else that like Nike and Apple have done to be inclusive and to virtue signal. Guess what? New York City, Chicago, wherever it was, they still broke into the stores and stole all your stuff, you dumbasses.
That's right. And how sincere can a rioter be who's fighting for all of these things if they're destroying a minority-owned business in their own neighborhood or someone else's neighborhood? How do you reconcile? And that's what Lindsay's talking about. These contradictions. These illogical motivations. How do you not question? Because you're told to shut off your conscience in the pursuit of this great cause. So what's right in front of you to realize is not there. You've been told to shut it out or ignore it or to opt for the pseudo-reality. And there lies, the problem, because what we're seeing, this larger movement, it's pretty darn big. It's not just the signs touting inclusivity in companies that you might work for. It is the bolstering of people into positions of power that will basically, they're just using the ideology, like we've said on many shows previously. It's not that the ideology needs the psychopath. The psychopath needs the ideology. That's their vehicle. That is their road to power. So,
and that was something that we had discussed one day, talking about like a new version of, or an updated version of Ponerology was that quote in particular. And what struck me about it, trying to figure out why that was, and what was it about it that really made things work. Well, now we can understand that the reason why the spellbinders need the ideology is because the only way that they can invert people's natural conscience and moral structures to the extent that they become on top, and what is immoral is seen as moral and good. And that's the only way, and that's why they need it. So if we don't buy into it, if we don't feed into it, there's nothing that they can do, and they will always be seen for what they really are.
And that's why one solution is to ruthlessly mock everything that's going on. And that's why maybe we'll close this. I recommended the article. I also recommend you check out James Lindsay's Twitter feed, because he's gloriously sarcastic and funny and effective at pointing these things out. So it's a daily string of insights from James Lindsay on Twitter about how this kind of thing works. And if you want to see a person who is how to put it, not shy about telling idiots that they're totally idiotic and just pointing out the total paralogic and paramorality of everything that's going on, give him a chance and check him out. And maybe with that said, we're going to end the show for today. We'll be revisiting these topics, probably pretty regularly throughout this year, because it's probably the most important, one of the most important things that we can talk about this year, because of everything that's going on. So with that said, check out the article. We'll put some links in the show description, and we'll see you next week.